All right, welcome everybody. My name is Ryan Turnbull, and I'm the Diocesan Discipleship Developer. And this is lecture 4 of our series, Words Strain, Lectures in Anglican Poetics. And this lecture series is part of a broader year-long project that we have funding for from the Calvin Institute for Vital Preaching, Vital Worship, and via the Lilly Foundation, to take a look at this idea of a poetic Anglican tradition. When I first kind of ventured into this very parish, actually, St. Margaret's, I was encountered by some people who said, we don't really have an animating theologian that stands behind Anglicanism, like some of the other Protestant denominations do, right? Like you can think of Calvin and Luther and Zwingli. Here we have a prayer book, and we have a bunch of poets. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And so I'm very grateful to the good people at Calvin for giving us some money to figure out what does this mean, and how can that kind of revitalize our worshiping life. And so this part of it, this Words Strain lecture series, has been a bit of a pilgrimage around the diocese. We started at the cathedral up in the North End, and then we went out to Brandon Diocese, and we had a lecture at their cathedral. Last week, we were entertained by Dr. David Watt at Holy Trinity downtown, where we learned about green men. And this evening, we are going to get to hear from a very special guest who hails from quite a ways away, here on George Herbert in Canadian poetry. But before I call up Paul Dick to introduce him, I wanted to flag a feature of this lecture series, which is these little stamps. As you came in, you might have noticed a little table with some, propaganda for the college, but also a stamp pad and a pile of paper. Seika Dick is a local artist and a parishioner here at St. Margaret's who specializes in print media, and she has designed these stamps, one for each church that we're going to along the way. So if you come to all the different lectures that we're doing in this series, you can collect kind of a little booklet of stamps, kind of like on the Camino. If you've ever been on the Camino, you can get a little pilgrimage passport. So I would encourage you all to make sure you get a stamp on the way out, because they're quite unique to this series. One bit of housekeeping before we begin. There's bathrooms just through this door or down the stairs. After the lecture, we're going to break just for a few minutes to grab coffee. I think there's some baking left over. And then we're going to come back and have a little bit of time in Q&A, and then we can carry on into the evening with our conversation. But with that, I would like to introduce Paul Dick to come and introduce our speaker.
I'm very pleased to introduce Gary Kuchar tonight. Gary is professor of English and Cultural, Social, and Political Thought at the University of Victoria. And having him speak here at St. Margaret's has long been a desire of mine. We met back in 2006 when we were on a panel together, and we spent the rest of the day along with another friend, Ken Graham, someone we're becoming friends with, talking about George Herbert and much more. Gary is an energetic and generous conversationalist, a careful thinker who makes clear distinctions, but who always gives conversation partners the benefit of the doubt. His great learning is animated by a genuine care and a wonderful modesty and self-deprecating humor. I come away from talking with him feeling encouraged and inspired. Gary is a real scholar's scholar. His books include The Poetry of Religious Sorrow in Early Modern England, from Cambridge in 2008, George Herbert and the Mystery of the Word, which is from Palgrave in 2017, and most recently, Shakespeare and the World of Slings and Arrows, Poetic Faith in a Postmodern Age, from McGill Queen's just 2 years ago. His books and articles are the sort of thing that you find yourself going back to when he writes about topics like prayer or baptism, the kinds of things we think we already understand. They become new and mysteriously simple. Prayer as discovery, baptism as entry into a story. You can keep on exploring his scholarship, going back to the books, looking up the footnotes, it's so rich. But he also gives you an insight that you can keep meditating on, revolving it in your breast, as we might say, and live by. Tonight he will speak to us about George Herbert and Canadian poetry, both of which I think you will never quite think of the same way again. Please welcome Gary Kuchar.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm really delighted to be here. Just a quick, and thanks to everybody who's organized this and to St. Margaret's. I'm having a wonderful time here. Just a quick word about where this paper came from. It was a homework assignment that I was given by the George Herbert Society for the triennial meeting at Trinity in Toronto this May. And they specifically asked me to write a paper in which I answered the question, what presence does George Herbert have in Canada? And they expected me to cover the whole of it, and from pre-Confederation all the way through. And I very sort of quietly kind of said, I'll take 1940 forward, and because it turns out that that's really what matters for Herbert. So the paper was written with George Herbert scholars in mind at this George Herbert Society. So I've tried to tweak it just a little bit so it's not quite presuming as much familiarity with Herbert, but it's essentially the same paper that it was. So it's a little bit intricate, it's a little bit quote heavy, but if nothing else, I'll introduce you to 4 astoundingly good Canadian poets who love and respond to Herbert. So that's sort of where this paper comes from. So in Canada, the tradition of 17th century metaphysical poetry began making a broad impact on the literary scene in the 1940s, getting something of an early start in Leo Kennedy's 1933 collection, The Shrouding, a sequence in which the regenerative paradoxes of Herbert's The Temple echo alongside those of John Donne and T.S. Eliot. But what presence exactly does Herbert have in the Canadian literary scene? Is there a coherent story to be told about Herbert's influence and role in Canadian poetry, one that might shed a bit of light on the question of Anglican poetics in Canada? The general answer to this, if we're working a little liberally, is I think yes. Because Canadian poets working in the metaphysical tradition often turn to Herbert at specific moments when they have a specific kind of need. That is, when the question of poiesis is explicitly at stake, the question of how poetic making works, from whence it arises, how it's related to phenomena such as prayer and revelation, as well as what, if any, sort of redress it ultimately makes in the world. So if Herbert has left a discernible mark on Canadian poetics, it's in the concern poets such as Margaret Avison, Richard Outram, Don Domansky, and Luke Hathaway have given to the question of poiesis, particularly the question of how the poetic imagination intersects with and thereby transforms fields of reality that are for these writers, as for the influential Canadian critic Northrop Frye, who's an influence on them, partially created and partially discovered. So it's not only Herbert the poet who is important here, but it's also Herbert the theorist, because Herbert's often thinking about poiesis within his poetic form. And so it's that combination of the poet and the theorist that I think is going to be important for us. Now, in responding to Herbert's concern with poetry as a means of accessing spiritual realities, our 4 poets often place their 17th century predecessor within a broader visionary tradition most fully articulated in Canada by Northrop Frye, the tradition that runs from Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare through to Milton, Blake, and into the 20th century to T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens. So at the same time, though, each of these 4 Canadian poets shows deep sensitivity to apophatic traditions, those negative theological traditions in which silence, unknowing, and humility are used to carve out the space for the unsaid and the unsayable vis-a-vis the transcendent. So resituating Herbert in the post-romantic and modernist context that so often preoccupied Fry, these four poets reveal that Herbert's The Temple continues to matter in a Canada which is perhaps only now sufficiently post-secular to begin really appreciating this visionary strain of the country's poetry. So, part one. Oh, did I just mess that up? Does it not click? Can you go to the next slide? That's okay. Yeah. Perfect. So, and you can go to the first quote too if you like. So, part one, George Herbert as spiritual witness in the poetry of Margaret Avison. It was in the context of the modernist rediscovery of metaphysical poetry that the 20-something Toronto-based poet Margaret Avison came to love George Herbert, identifying him in a 1943 conversation as her favorite writer. Intriguingly, this was a full 20 years before Avison's midlife reconversion to Christianity and her subsequent avowal of poetry writing as a religious vocation, an event that occurred about 3 years after the 1960 publication of her first award-winning collection, Winter Sun, in which Herbert makes a conspicuous appearance in a long, complex poem about the ways in which egocentric economic thinking, characteristic of modern materialism, threatens but doesn't and cannot ultimately contain what she calls the pre-creation density or informing spiritual energy that animates both the human person as well as its natural environments. Beguilingly titled Intra-Political, an exercise in political astronomy, Avison's poem about the irresistibility of spiritual reality and its explosive transfiguring force begins with a description of humans as comestibles with the trick of turning grosser, only to end with a reference to Herbert's Love 3, which presents a mode of eating exemplary of the capacious yet grounded nature of the properly liberated human spirit, one centered on the recognition that human beings don't live by bread alone. This turn to Herbert as an antidote to the claustrophobia of modern materialism raises challenging interpretive problems as Avison's subsequent This turn to Herbert as an antidote to the claustrophobia of modern materialism raises challenging interpretive problems as Avison's subsequent conversion inevitably appears as a crucial, though troublingly retrospective context for understanding it. Avison herself implicitly endorses a post-conversion rereading, a kind of anachronistic rereading of Intrapolitical in a 1968 essay she wrote called Muse of Danger, when she describes the phenomena of spiritual witnessing or testimony in the idioms of George Herbert's poem, The Temper. In reworking Herbert's Jonanine idioms in The Temper, she more than implies that unbeknownst to her pre-conversion self, Herbert had been playing the role of spiritual witness for her at something like a subconscious level. As such, she intimates that it was partly by reading Herbert that she underwent a profound conversion, replete with full-blown vision and paranormal phenomena. Hence, her recourse to the prohibitory tone of Herbert's Superliminare when she warns that there's nothing safe about religious poetry, that it's in the nature of an authoritative poem to transform oneself in unpredictable, even dangerous ways. And here's the quote, "But in his strange and marvelous mercy, God nonetheless lets the believer take a necessary place as a living witness in behavior with family and classmate and stranger, in conversation, or in a poem. Thus each of us may find the word in his newness through every way and every day. The poem can no more be a safe venture than a direct human encounter can. Here too, the believer is fully involved, all the more fully because of his faith." Echoing Herbert's warning that the divine word suddenly doth raise and race, and every day a new creator art, Avison intimates two things that prove decisive for her poetic and religious vocations. First, Herbert served for her not only as a poetic model, but also as spiritual witness, testifying to the operations of the spirit within the soul as well as within language, including through the autonomous operations of verse, the way a lyric, such as interpolitical, can come to reveal things the author herself could only appreciate long after composing it, very much in the ways that are analogous to the operations of divine grace. This is one of the stunning things about writing poetry is you come back to it even when you've composed it and realize that the words are doing their own thing. And I think she experienced this with interpolitical. And second, that Herbert's role as witness has as much to do with his approach to biblical revelation, to the somewhat paradoxical way that words can disclose Christ's presence plainly and confidently, while at the same time deepening one's sense of God's unknowable mysteriousness. As Avison will say in her poem Prayer from her penultimate 2006 collection, Momentary Dark, one more. Does that begin? Sorry. Yeah. Let the unknowing structure what is known. Let what they think they know be three ways verified. Once by the human hearer who proved he could be trusted in death and life, always. An example of Avison's mature interest in negative or apophatic theology, the poem's title, along with the phrase three ways verified, suggests a Herbertian subtext, recalling as it does Herbert's Easter's description of music as three parts vied and multiplied. Like Herbert's poem Easter, which asks the Father to let thy blessed Spirit bear a part and make up our defects with his sweet art, so Avison's prayer asks that others might discover trust in Christ as the basis of a mode of spiritual apprehension in which knowing and unknowing are inextricably intertwined. Hence, her concluding and richly elusive remark about God's simultaneous presence and absence in the soul, let the inner hearing create listening, so that the presence, not here, not yet, may speak. Effectively glossing her own retrospective understanding of an earlier poem, Interpolitical, the idea that unknowing should structure what is known might also be construed as a gloss on the biblical vision expressed in Herbert's lyric, The Flower. The idea, we say amiss, this or that is, thy word is all, if we could spell. Like Herbert, Avison sees the experience of unknowing as an inevitable dimension of any properly biblical-oriented poetics, one in which careful attention to words and interpretation combines with a humble sense of human limitation and the proclivity for what Richard Outram would later call, with reference to Herbert, graced error. So what's crucial for Herbert is that Scripture's significance, if not always its meaning, can evolve with time, place, and person, so that you read a story when you're 12, it resonates for you in one way. You read it when you're 40, it resonates another way. You read it when you're 70, it resonates richly and differently yet. He said that this is the characteristic of Scripture. So there's a bit of similarity between Herbert's kind of open-ended view of Scripture as this evolving context and, say, Milton's view of Scripture as a river that's flowing. And if you freeze it in time and place too much, you kill it. And so for Herbert, the experience of being an error is an inevitable, crucial, and important positive dimension of the experience of growth and of maturity. Now, when Herbert appears at the end of Avison's Interpolitical, he resolves the explosive buildup of spiritual energy in this most remarkable of poems, the pre-creation density that our darkness dreams of, this heavy mass, this moil, this self-consuming endless squirm and squander, this chaos, singling off, not into the suicidal violence of Shakespeare's Richard III, whose escalating rhythms in the Now Is Our Winter of Discontent speech is audible in the background here, but into a new genesis, a new transformation. The creatively destructive violence of Interpolitical ends with the simple, rhythmically balanced lines. Number 5, George Herbert, and he makes it plain, guest at this same transfiguring board, did sit and eat. So the lines, this transfiguring board, are a reflexive reference to the poem, to poetry, and to Herbert as a kind of key guide and model of what a spiritual poetics can be. Now, about 3 years after the publication of Winter's Sun, on 4 January 1963, Avison would come to a more personal and thus more profound understanding of what such transfiguration really means. When, upon reading John 14, you believe in God, believe also in me, Christ became, as she says, in the very idioms of Intrapolitical, impingingly present before me. Anxious that this renewed awareness of Christ's reality would mean the loss of her poetic vocation, which happens with some poets, right? When they overcome their religious struggles, their poetic vocation disappears. So she's worried about this. In the wake of this fear, she had a vision of iron filings on her writing desk arranging themselves of their own accord in a design of angles, arcs, and curving lines. And if you've ever seen an interview with Avison, she comes across as a very grounded, no-nonsense, clear-minded kind of person. So for her to open up about this kind of paranormal vision, it has a certain authority when she narrates it. Taking this as a sign, this arranging of filings as a sign that her poetic vocation would be regenerated rather than annulled, she indicates further that her next quote, her 5 senses were noticeably quickened. Creative ideas abounded. In fact, a new design had come into my life, like that iron filing display taking shape on my desk. Fulfilling the desire expressed at the end of Intrapolitical, Avison's conversion retrospectively reads as a commentary on her own allusion to Herbert, who appears not only at the end of Intrapolitical, but also at its beginning and in its middle. For Intrapolitical begins by asking the same question as Herbert's poem, Man, who are we here? Only to crescendo towards the near emotional paroxysm similar to Herbert's highly anthologized The Caller, the distractions of which are deftly resolved by the assurances of Love 3, the final poem in the church. The presiding genius of one of Avison's major poems, Herbert not only provides an escape route from the occluding narrowness of modern materialism, but he also helps delineate distraction and existential claustrophobia as spiritual problems. For like The Caller, Intrapolitical is about the energy or sparks that fly when one chafes between self-centered economic thinking versus a more spiritually capacious longing for meaning and genuine freedom. A tension that half intimates the presence of the divine while remaining more explicitly focused on human and natural forces. So caught in the vice grip of these competing perspectives, the material and the transcendent, Avison foresees a kind of explosion, writing partly with reference to Hopkins and partly with brilliant control over the effects of her poem. This is the next quote. But even our energy will out. String beans and coronal pyres of sleep keg up. These city shelves, this play emporium, wobble on nitroglycerin. So it's kind of extraordinary because she's kind of writing in anticipation of her own conversion here, this buildup of energy. And the play of sound is quite remarkable here because when you read those lines out loud, it's very hard to pronounce the word city as though it were not written S-H-I-T-T-Y. It's the only example of that I've ever come across. It's quite clever. Faced with this sense of growing combustion, Avison asks if a renewed faith might potentially open up an immense answering of human skies, a new expectant largeness. Now, in posing these questions, what she foresees is that her religious conversion will not simplify life, nor render it less intellectual or more consoling. Instead, her spiritual opening will make life a little more difficult, but grander, more challenging, yet more consequential, even as it will help disclose the forms of complex simplicity embodied in Herbert's writing, his scripturalism, and his person. Right? Because the trick of a Herbert poem is when you read it, you think you've got it. You think it's this relatively straightforward, clear kind of thing, and then you read it again and you start noticing all the difficulty in it, and then you read it a 10th time and you realize it's bigger than you and you haven't discovered it. And it's this play of creating the effect of simplicity which is real, and there's a plainness to it, but it conceals this kind of infinite richness that I think Avison is partly responding to here. Now, in coming to terms with these dimensions of Herbert's life and art, Avison developed a poetic vocation premised on the principle that in Christian faith, unknowing structures what is known, thereby allowing God to always remain God, while at the same time bearing witness to the moral realities embodied in the person of Christ. Now, to fully understand Avison's poetics, then, is to appreciate how these aspects of Herbert's life and work served as witness for her. While Avison's conversion animates several poems in her first post-conversion collection, The Dumbfounding, it's the ironically titled poem Searching and Sounding that I think best exemplifies how Herbert helped lead Avison into conversion, while also deepening her understanding of what would then follow from it. First, the irony of the title is Herbertian because it's not so much the speaker who's doing the searching as it is Christ, even as the speaker busily runs away from God the very moment she recovers him, or rather, God recovers her. In this sense, Christ is not absent so much as impingingly present, appearing, quote, in light so strong it seems a shadow of further light. Struggling to integrate the over-presence of God, Avison's speaker discovers what the priest in Herbert's poem Aaron confidently asserts, namely that it is another head, another heart and breast, another music, making live not dead, without whom I could have no rest. In him I am well dressed. On this account, the order of the soul is found through and grounded in Christ's regenerating presence. A little less assured than Herbert's speaker, Avison reaches for something very much like St. Paul's idea that it's not I who live, but Christ who lives in me, when she says, my heart is sore, but you have come and sounded a music around me newly, as though you can clear all tears from our eyes only, if we sound the wells of weeping with another's heart and hear another's music only. The knotted angularity of earlier lines and poems now disappears, as Avison's verse becomes both more musical and more plain, with her careful wreathing of assonance and alliteration recreating Herbert's sound as well as his sense. And yet, the poem's concluding image maintains much of Avison's celebrated strangeness and unpredictability, her no less Herbertian tendency to off-foot readers, keeping us ever unsure where and how things are moving. This off-footing happens in her highly peculiar and, I think, pregnant play on the word radium, which resonates with the word radius and all of those metaphors of God as a circle, while nevertheless being very surprising and electric. Recalling those magnetic filings that appeared then disappeared at the moment of her conversion, Avison concludes this other poem from Searching and Sounding with the typographically differentiated prayers. Is there? Yeah, the fourth one. Gather my fragments towards the radium, the all-swallowing moment once more. It appears now that that atomic explosion of interpolitical was not truly avoided in the end after all, for such an explosion was nothing less than the revelation of a divine presence that cannot be entombed in figure, emblem, or even hyperbole, any more than it can be boxed into the distracting myopias of materialism bemoaned in Interpolitical. Instead, Avison rediscovered a view of God's word as wild and ever-renewing, the one Herbert warned about in The Temper. In heeding Herbert's iconoclastic warning as a way of sustaining the revelatory force of poetry, Avison developed an approach to poesis that made her nothing less than Canada's most formidable Christian poet, one whose important pre-conversion poem seems to have foreseen something of our own post-secular moment, as it appears that spiritual energy is not so easy to contain after all. That was part one. So the next part is part two. Poesis, faith, and vision in the work of Richard Outram. Now, if no Canadian poet has taken Herbert's spiritual authority as seriously as Avison, that no Canadian poet has responded to the temple and the broader tradition of which it forms a part in as conceptually rich or as elusively sustained a way as Richard Outram. Born in Oshawa, Ontario in 1930, an author of 21 poetry collections, many of which were illustrated by his beloved artist wife, Barbara Howard, Outram references Herbert in a number of different contexts, including a 2001 interview titled Faith and Resilience, in which he was asked to give his thoughts on several poetic influences, the first of which was Herbert. Upon being asked to say a few words on Herbert, Outram responded, affection above all, only to then commend Herbert for being as tough as they come, a wonderfully gentle, compassionate, steely Christian. Such Auden-like admiration helps explain the book jacket to Outram's 88 collection, Hyman Jenny, which echoes the epigraph to the temple, and it reads, "This book is about the comings and goings, the deeds and evasions, the private poems and sacred ejaculations of one Hiram and his lady friend Jenny, who live in and around a small town somewhere in the Canadian Maritimes." More revealingly, Outram begins his 1991 lecture on poetry and poetics titled An Exercise in Exegesis with an epigraphic quotation from Herbert's The Elixir, "A man that looks on glass, on it may stray his eye, or, if he please it, through it pass, and then the heaven espy." Like Iris Murdoch, Simone Weil, and his mentor and teacher Northrop Frye, Outram is something of a modified Platonist, and it's in the context of his moral and metaphysical realism that we must place his sustained interest in Herbert's poesis, most notably his various attempts to attend to the particularities of nature by placing them within the context of the eternal and the universal. For it's by repeatedly locating hyper-particularized cultural detail, natural detail, within a vision of cosmic unity that Outram rediscovers a redemptive form of vision proper to the kind of apocalyptic humanism he learned from his master Northrop Frye, and which he articulates repeatedly in reference to Herbert. Though not a creedal Christian, Outram is nevertheless self-consciously rooted in the biblical myth and the Neoplatonic tradition. As such, Outram generally resituates Herbert's work in a post-romantic context, asking how the poet half creates and half discovers renewed forms of spiritual and moral order. Importantly, though, Herbert's influence on Outram extends beyond a shared thematic concern with the role that faith and grace play in the production of a biblically inflected imagination. Deeply influenced by Herbert formally, Outram shares the temple's concern with relating word to image in lyrics composed in strict metrical and stanzaic forms, most of which are then organized into complexly interlocking sequences consisting of various kinds of personae. So taken together, these Herbertian features make Outram's wry, dense, formally taught poems highly unusual, and I would say not a little underappreciated in the context of late 20th century Canadian verse. He's not completely unknown, though. There was a wonderful episode of CBC Sunday show on Outram with, what was it, Zosky? And it's available on the internet. So he's not completely unknown. And he's beloved by Canadian bookbinders, the bookmakers, because of the wonderful books that he and his wife produced. But he's not a major figure in the Canadian scene right at the moment. In deploying Herbert's The Elixir, Outram's Exercise in Exegesis attempts to show how the poetic imagination constitutes a specific form of attention, one designed to clarify, even as it partly generates, the relationship between mind and world, image and truth. In exploring these questions, Outram discusses a previously unpublished poem he wrote titled Window for Rosemary, a lyric which resonates in the context not only of The Elixir, but also with reference to Herbert's own exploration of similar issues in his poem, The Windows. Consisting of two brief vignettes and a highly condensed epiphany, this three-stanza poem, as Outram explains, is, quote, intended to be both its own witness to and defense of poetry, of poesis. Typical of Outram's penchant for compression, the first vignette evokes the image of early pioneer settlers discovering their own story in the context of biblical prophecy. Number 2. Ezekiel's wheel was proof, by ice light contrived, in the frozen sod roof that they had survived. If an ancient prophet's vision helps these early settlers discover an unlikely home in the winter light of their frozen hut, the bored tourists of stanza 2 are unable to accomplish anything equivalent as they walk through two famous European cathedrals without casting or discovering light of any sort. Glory, the guide drones, was an anonymous art. Like locusts, the shutters buzz at Salisbury and Chartres. Now, the light of prophetic vision in stanza 1 vanishes as the locust-like buzz of camera shutters deadens the experience. To make the point, Outram recalls Joseph Brodsky's witticism, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, now gives way to Kodak ergo sum, a point that has not lost its edge, I think, in the subsequent years. Faced with this opposition of light and dark, of lasting vision versus vanishing things, the poem's dedicatee, Rosemary, suddenly discovers how to approach her art of stained glass window making, a craft isomorphically associated with her name. She turns to light and knows thereby where to begin, the radiant stained rose lit from within. Like Herbert's preacher in the windows, who anneals God's story within his person, thereby uniting doctrine and life, colors and light, so Rosemary Kilbourne, a celebrated Canadian illustrator, brings to her craft a moral and spiritual authority that turns art into revelation, aesthetic order into revealed moral vision. By the end of the poem, then, we see that the title window refers to both the artist's eye as well as the work of art itself. So we have a similar kind of reflexive thing going on as with Avison. In making this discovery, Outram's poem tries to demonstrate what he takes to be an article of poetic faith that, I think we can go to the next one. Every realized poem can aspire to be a microcosm of the macrocosm of reality, a hologram of the entire universe of language, a homunculus of the entire human body, of human thought and understanding. In trying to capture the relationship between life and art, representation and reality, Outram's window shows the influence of Northrop Frye's concept of anagogy on him, the idea that a single literary text can mirror the totality of literary creation as a whole. In Herbert's The Temple, something of this idea finds expression through the patristic concept that Jesus recapitulates all things within himself, embodying and fulfilling all acts of creation, a theological insight Frye translated into a critical principle of visionary poetics in the chapter on anagogy from his 1957 masterwork, Anatomy of Criticism. Thus, one of the things that made Herbert appealing to Outram is the way his art of compression is undergirded by a visionary insight in which the particular and the universal can interpenetrate, in a way that refracts the whole of the biblical myth in micro, while nevertheless not trespassing on God's illegible transcendence. As Outram says, it is highly ironic but earnestly visionary celebration of the Toronto Islands in his Dante-esque sequence halfway along. Everywhere is center, friend. Presume not God to scan. But if Herbert centered his anagogical principle in the person of Christ, Outram followed William Blake, Frye, and cybernetic theorist Gregory Bateson in locating it in ecstatic states of consciousness, a principle of poetic faith in which the minute particularities of life disclose the larger realities which they form a part without losing any of their diversity or individuality in the process, as in the part-whole pattern visible in the nautilus shell, which follows the Fibonacci sequence shown on the cover of Frye's Secular Scripture. Central to Outram's Blakean-inflected Platonism, this interpenetration of the particular with the universal is explored at length in a 1973 sequence called Seer, S-E-E-R, which was reproduced in his longer 79 collection, The Promise of Light. This 20-poem sequence begins with an exploration of the mind's return to its divine source that's called Seer on Return Journey. Yet here again, Outram's poem resonates in the context of Herbert's concerns with the dangers of idolatry inherent in visual and verbal art, both in the Elixir as well as in Herbert's Jordan poems. Hence the stress placed in Outram's Seer poem on poetry as a form of discovery, a visionary reconfiguring of the world's minute particularities within a larger cosmic unity. It reads, "Where an image might step forth, he starts up another flight. Somehow he must pass without a glance that discovered glass, lest reflection trace the bone beneath his averted face, or lest he recognize the staring void sockets of those eyes." Like Herbert's Jordan too, the distinction here is between a self-indulgent poetry that is stillborn versus a living verse that interpenetrates with reality. In the final poem of the sequence, Seer and Light, the dangers of death-like self-absorption identified are overcome by seeing the unity of death in life, an insight that recalls Fry's observation that death is not the opposite of life, but of birth. And watching the sun and water embody a rhythm forever ending, as each was new begun, Outram gets out of his own way, much as Herbert gets out of his own way in the Jordan poems, in order to see how now the commonplace is rare, broken into brilliant bits and scattered, God knows, everywhere, and I have lost my native wits. This last confession is a wry admission that he has finally seen through the discovered glass of material reality, not by abandoning or disavowing it for eternity, but by seeing the particularities in the context of eternity, a mode of vision that reconfigures the rhythms of life and death within the holistic context of the divine, thereby redeeming them. Such creative self-annihilation also occurs in a poem he wrote called Vocations, in which the murderous self-destruction of assassins, torturers, hunters, and jealous husbands is contrasted with and then reconciled to the annihilations of aesthetic and spiritual grace associated with the visionary poetic line that runs from Spencer through Herbert to Blake. And each of these poets is named in the poem, and he sort of dedicates one stanza to each of these poems, giving a sense of the whole sweep of this visionary line in which he places Herbert, which is not an obvious move to make. It's not obvious to place Herbert and William Blake in the same breath. Yet all of these themes find consummate expression in Outram's response to Herbert's Prayer 1 in a poem called In Praise of Poetry, a sonnet in which the process of simultaneously discovering and generating self-transcendence through love and art is expressed in one exquisitely balanced sentence, where the poetic act is both free and graced, both made and found. This is the whole poem, and I think, frankly, it's Outram at his best, especially in terms of his allusions to Herbert. Bright in my lamplight burrow on the page, the forecast shadow of a present, next, last intimation of an angel's age falls on a mind abandoned to a text, ascendant and explicit, having known a scripture infinite, its meanings made, our naked raiment, and this world seams sewn, and all analogy and soul's parade resolving in the love that sloughs us there, that butterfly conundrum where we seemed abandoning ourselves, still unaware for once. We are not dreaming and not dreamed, but something understood, our soul arrayed in various light and praying, being prayed. For Outram, the infinite scripture out of which such experiences are recreated is both the Bible and what Fry called the secular scripture, both the founding myth and the broader total poem of human creation, spiraling out of and thereby recontaining it anew. Alongside Fry, Herbert's Anglican voice was a privileged presence within Outram's visionary matrix. That was part 2. So part 3, a Lazarus in Everything, Don Domansky and the Origins of Prayer. It's been said that the basic underlying rhythm of Herbert's poetry can be heard in its patterns of dying to rise again that characterizes the spiritual life. If we turn the dial of immanence way, way up and strict transcendence way, way down, turning from an orthodox Christianity to a radically apophatic poetics, one focused on the lives of lichens, roots, and stones more than the biblical Christ, something similar might be said of Don Domanski, to my mind, a poet of unparalleled power in the Canadian scene. While Domanski doesn't demonstrate a sustained interest in Herbert as Outram or Avison, he nevertheless makes a subtle recourse to Herbert's Prayer 1 in a poem of astonishing dignity and reach, a 4-part lyric that does nothing less than envision the prehistorical origins of prayer, envisioning the Paleolithic beginnings of poetry and worship, including his own poetry and Herbert's poetry. So, in the business of literary criticism, we call this trick metalepsis, where you create the effect that the cause of an event happens very, very far in the past. So Domanski creates the effect that the cause of this poem I'm going to discuss was the woman poet inside the poem itself. Milton loves this rhetorical figure, right? Paradise Lost is one metaleptic trick after another, where Milton tries to create the effect that he was there at the beginning of things along with the Holy Spirit. Now, in essence, then, the title poem of Domanski's 1998 collection, Parish of the Physic Moon, presents the first encounter with what Rudolf Otto in his groundbreaking study called the holy. Born in Cape Breton in 1950, Domanski spent most of his adult life in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he passed away in 2020, leaving behind 9 books of poetry, including the 2007 Governor General's award-winning All Our Wonder Unavenged. An accomplished fossil hunter, Domanski's credited with discovering the neural arch of a 350 million-year-old amphibian previously thought to have gone extinct in the Devonian period. Similarly, he was also an expert in Stone Age tools and meteorites. This is a fascinatingly odd man. Pastimes that help explain how he developed a poetically unparalleled sense of the prehistorical and the primeval, fluently moving across geological and human timescales in his verse. And it was partly on the basis of this enormous sense of scale that the celebrated poet Mark Strand said of Domanski in 1990 that he thought that there was no better poet writing in English. A remarkable assertion when you remember that 1990 Seamus Heaney and Geoffrey Hill were both still alive. But I think it's a plausible assertion. I don't think it's hyperbole. In keeping with such a sense of scale, Domanski's spiritual outlook is not that of a naturalist so much that as a syncretist. Viewed as a whole, his poetry rests on a deep appreciation of negative theology, especially Meister Eckhart, a lifetime reading of Buddhism, Taoism, and Celtic studies, as well as a host of esoteric traditions from Gnosticism and Tarot all the way up to the morphogenetic theories of maverick biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Thus, if there's a God to be found in Domanski's cosmopoesis, it's a God who is both sublimely and comically immanent within a radically evolving world. What he calls in his 1986 collection, Hammerstroke, the God of creation. The idea of God as part of his creation informs Domanski's approach to poesis, insofar as he centers his craft on the principle that creating being is the great mystery reenacted on the page and in the psyche. So for him, the power of every poem is the way that it repeats the initial act of creation. On this account, every good poem repeats, echoes, and confirms the original act of creation, linking part to whole in a way that implies a certain kind of Neoplatonism. In a poem from Hammerstroke called The God of Creation, Domanski presents God not as a trinity, but as a husband and wife, both of who are responsible for the play of death and resurrection in the created world. The way, as he says elsewhere, there is a Lazarus in everything. Recalling the Kabbalistic idea of the broken vessels, the principle that there's a crack in everything, as Leonard Cohen says, Domanski's sense that there's a resurrecting life principle animating the physical world presupposes no necessary opposition between divinity and imperfection, eternity and transience. Hence, his comically mythopoetic depiction of God as a kind of odd couple. Overseeing both the macrocosmic and the microscopic, the contingent and the necessary, Domanski's divine couple generates a dance of interconnections that is as surprising as they are unsentimental, as ordinary as they are sacred, which is also that last point, something Herbert's a genius at, making the ordinary feel very sacred. It's within this cosmic context, keenly sensitive to the sacred contingencies of birth and death, that Domanski situates prayer, both in Hammerstroke and in the title poem of Parish of the Physic Moon, the first section of which, Sleeps Ova, explores forms of descent into temporal, geographical, and cosmic underworlds. Epic in reach, Parish of the Physic Moon establishes a temporally complex relation with Herbert's Prayer 1, especially the concluding image of prayer as church bells beyond the stars heard, which first appears in Domanski's collection in a poem called Shadows, where the intimation of a lost infant resonates for him like a bell for a church deep in the earth. But if Herbert's poem delineates the dynamics of prayer, expressing what it is as an experience, Parish presents a myth of its origins. As such, Domanski's poem is part imagined history, part Paleolithic parable, and part meditation on the spiritual work that transpires in sleep, dream, and vision. Broken into 4 sections, the first part of the poem takes us into a prehistorical world animated by a fear of predation and the overpresence of all things, including the silences, spaces, and shadows that populate Domanski's haunted verse, his central and recurring image being the space between the pines. In this particular poem, we're initially confronted with a world that is too excessively overpresent, too undifferentiated to be described as sacred or enchanted. In this Paleolithic world with its bicameral mind, everything is vital and alive, humming too loudly with presence to be described as enchanted. So where T.S. Eliot gives us the dregs of humanity at the end of history in The Hollow Men, Domanski redeploys Eliot's imagery to give us the opposite, the first men, or in this case woman, on the very threshold of history. That is, a history is about to break open into the sacred. So you can see what Domanski's going to be doing in this poem is trying to dig beneath the cultural weight of accumulated history to get back to what Avison called the pre-creation density of this pre-cultural vitality that is the divine within the created world. Domanski's poem begins, this is the first major quote, "There were tenements of shadows left behind in the grass by rabbit and deer, poor men hid in them, trying to stay warm, hunters without fires or homes to return to, dead men lost behind a leaf. There were fireballs set in motion by any movement of the eye, pupae chanting, plaster falling from the moon, bees asleep like lovers, dissolving their edges round a sigh." In this prehistorical world, the problem's not an absence of meaning or presence, but their undifferentiated overabundance. Enter then the woman at the center of the poem, a young mother-to-be who will call this differentiation into existence, and with it, the imaginative distance made possible by poetry and prayer. Loosely associated with the calm and distressed Lady of Silences from Eliot's Ash Wednesday, we meet her in section 2, which develops the sense of vulnerability stalking this Paleolithic world, all of which is expressed in a listing pattern reminiscent of Prayer 1. So it's almost as though these listing patterns are almost unconsciously preparing us for the final image, which is so explicitly a reference to Herbert. This is part 2. "It was difficult for her to bear the temper of birches, their emotional walks down to the river, hard to live with all those presences among the trees, snakes placing subspaces beneath every movement, each fox a spirit of dominions overgrown with existence, patterns implacable, rituals merciless, hawks in their banners, mice in their afterlives." If the forces of nature are pressing upon the world of the poem, overwhelming it with an explosive energy even more chthonic than Avison's pre-creation density, so too is the future, which appears in the following stanza at the level of image. Or more precisely, we begin to feel the future impinging on this pre-Paleolithic world at the level of its metaphysical conceits, those unexpected links joining the prehistorical past to humanity's spiritual destiny in the now looming future. Such pressure can be felt in the way the sacred, again, as in Avison, wants to break out of the natural world, but remains too imminent in its violence and creativity to register as separate from nature. Yeah, this is the next quote. And the sounds among the roots were like a din of clouds in a tomb, rattle of arrows in a cathedral, sounds that foretold the coming of reality, roots where the prayers drank up the water, a tight array of believers, a continuous gratitude, dark nunneries in the soil. Well, the rattle of arrows in a cathedral might suggest the spiritual violence of Herbert's engine against the Almighty. And while the sounds that foretold the coming of reality might evoke his line, Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, or something understood, they do not yet reach beyond themselves far enough to accommodate a sense of the sacred as in any way distinct from the pure presence of things. That is, we're not yet quite through Outram's discovered glass. What we're witnessing in Domanski's extraordinary images is something like the breakdown in the woman's bicameral mind, as she's on the verge of differentiating physical from spiritual thirst, dream from vision, thereby giving rise to consciousness of the sacred that appears like a Paleolithic replay of Avison's Intrapolitical. As a result, Domanski will soon differentiate his voice from the woman's in the poem, so as to give her a reality mythic in proportion and force. In this way, the poem becomes about birth in several senses: the birth of a child, the birth of prayer, and the birth of mythic vision. But in section 3 of the poem, each of these births still remains slightly tangled together, as the woman's described as the sleeper, troubled by a complicated pregnancy. This begins the sleeper. The sleeper was expected, a luminous malady to fill the spaces, the invisibilities that made the sign of the miracle, which was the sleeper in her bed, heartsick, exhausted, a woman who made the dark crossing, and the world that followed her was a divine world, where the wind blew blood into the heart, night directly into the mind. This crossing over into a world where presence is infused with negativity occurs in the confrontation with her own luminous wound, a pain and violence simultaneously birth and creativity, body and spirit, as they start to become distinguishable. Moreover, her poetic act is experienced as though it were not entirely her own. Instead, her creativity partly emerges from the visible marks of her physical vulnerability, her own blood as she slips into prayer. So she, with the grief of palms folded over a will adorned with transmutations, of courage wounded, inhaled along a vein with the grief of lines shaken loose from the outline of blood on the floor. The sight of her own blood then gives rise to the magic words of the first prayer, which appear in the fourth and final section. In this final section of the poem, Domanski's presence as poet overlaps with, even as it becomes differentiated from, his own creation, as the sleeping woman becomes the first poet, making possible the space Domanski, Herbert, and Eliot inhabit. Begins "O Tremble." I don't know if is it on there? And that might be the next one. Yeah. Oh. Let me say that one more time. Oh. Where I can find my spot. Tremble me there, said the sleeper, among the rush of ghosts under the bark who raid the world that I conceived. But the sleeper only heard herself speaking, without knowing those words were the antidote, counter poison that would phantom a cure. The idea that her poetic prayer might intervene somehow in the world, might phantom a cure, is made good when Domanski makes his creation the cause of his own poem, magically figuring his sleeper as the source of Parish of the Physic Moon, as well as Herbert's Prayer 1, which helps close out the lyric. But the sleeper heard nothing but herself, speaking in the little town pressed between the pages of a book not yet written, pages not yet numbered. Her voice wrote the sentences on paper yet to be made, author of bindings and breath falling and a calling across eyes closed. This drifting downwards then gives way to a beguilingly beautiful articulation of how the opening of prayer occurs simultaneously with an opening to dream vision, to the growing recognition that the mind shapes even as it participates with and discloses reality. Oh, tremble me there, said the breath drifting, to hidden places, to wounds secret, the turning of a page, the white beneath the words that didn't exist except as scales along the back, fear along the pubis, and hearts like church bells underwater, tolling asleep upon the sleep already there. In those final lines, the solace and mystery of Herbert's church bells beyond the stars heard become the newfound, new created, yet still to be unfolded solace of a deeper rest than existed before. A sleep in which the emerging world of the imagination brings the distance from reality that was lacking at the beginning of the poem. A distance out of which a more capacious and differentiated reality will emerge, and with it, Domanski's beautiful but brutal sense of the holy. At the same time, the ending intimates that both the woman and the child very well may be dying, so we get again this repetition and meditation on a lost infant. The overall effect is a poem beguilingly expressive of Domanski's sense that creating being is the great mystery reenacted on the page and in the psyche. That poetry derives its authority from the way it echoes, repeats, and renews the act of divine creation, even in the face of the most terrible tragedy. So, like Avison, Domanski's poem finds poetic and cosmic resolution in the sense of openness, of capaciousness associated with George Herbert. But it's a resolution he achieves that nevertheless looks death and danger squarely in the face. And so it's in Domanski's Parish of the Physic Moon that we see how Herbert's brand of steely Christian faith gets deeply transmuted in the windswept wilds of Cape Breton. The last part, conclusion. Luke Hathaway's The Affirmations. That Herbert's presence in Canada remains an ongoing affair is clear from Luke Hathaway's 2022 collection, The Affirmations, recently described in a year-end review as the best poetry collection of its year. A friend and scholar of Outram, Hathaway is a trans poet who teaches in Halifax, Nova Scotia, also turns to Herbert in order to think through the challenges of a sacred poesis that, while not orthodox, is nevertheless highly sensitive to the dynamics of correction and revision, error and discovery intrinsic to a biblical poetics. Now, the truth, though, is if you read The Affirmations and you didn't know its author doesn't identify as Christian, you would never know it. It is a deeply Christian, deeply biblical collection, but the author seems to be on the fence, at least in terms of where they stand. But the poem has this Marian sequence. It's a very, it reads like an Orthodox Christian collection. Appearing near the end of this collection, the lyric poem Frost resonates in the context of a series of Easter poems, including the 8-lyric Marian sequence titled The Temple. Though focused on the nativity and childhood of Christ, Hathaway's The Temple ends with a highly compressed 3-stanza poem titled Birth, in which the Marian paradoxes of the finite, containing and disclosing the infinite, are expressed in ways that the collection as a whole richly develops, thus continuing the Herbertian line of Outram and late Avison. It begins, "The darkness doesn't fathom light, the sea, the land, or death, life, but out of the other comes the one, the sea delivers up the sun, the sea delivers up the sun. The sea delivers up the sun." The figure of the sea here suggests not only Mary's womb, nor even creation as a whole, but the poetry that seeks to disclose the divine, a theme that becomes explicit a few poems later in a lyric titled Fire Flower. Also dedicated to the Canadian artist Rosemary Kilbourne, Fireflower adopts a more self-consciously aesthetic perspective on the incarnational paradoxes of birth, as it seeks to defend a poetry that insists upon what is. Recalling the Herbertian theme of enclosure, of being boxed in, which we also saw in Interpolitical, birth begins, these lines, next slide? Yeah. These lines, a cage that lions you around, all through the bars of which you fall upon me still as light. Expect another longer letter soon. This sense of gift and burden, of gravity and grace, soon leads to a variation of Herbert's "How should my rhymes gladly engrave thy love in steel?" as Hathaway plaintively confesses, "My palimpsested lines occlude you. Could engraving them reveal you? Or would you vanish utterly then?" Outram's and Herbert's meditations on stained glass give the description of Hathaway's poem its warrant. Their trace is not entirely vanished from a poem in search of the divine. Hence, it's Herbert-like meditation on the grammars of incarnation in its final two stanzas. Quote, "Since I've been out walking here, the sun has risen, present perfect. Sun rose in the simple past, a fire flower. Where are you? Expect another longer letter soon." The ostensible shortcomings of poetry here reflect Hathaway's sustained concern with the dynamics of a blessed failing, or what he calls in an essay on Outram's processes of correction and revision, graceful errors and happy intellections, a concern most fully developed in Frost. So you can see how it's Herbert's patterns of correction and revision that are so cooked into his poems that get worked through Outram and that get worked through Hathaway in a big way. Frost begins by acknowledging the apparent impossibility of ungraving the divine in verse, only to then attempt to do exactly that. Subtly shaped as an altar, Frost reframes Herbert's Easter in the context of St. Paul's image of visionary clarity in 1 Corinthians 13, and it beginning, "If not a poem, then perhaps some darkened glass, to interpose between the one whose mortal cold illuminates your breath and you, whose breath illuminates the cold." Though a lovely idea, the two-way mirror here gives way to a further paradox, as Herbert's initial failure to form a relationship with the risen Christ now intrudes on and thereby helps explain Hathaway's excessively naturalistic, if well-intentioned, designs. "I got me flowers to strew thy way. I got me boughs off many a tree, but thou wast up by break of day." Yet in Hathaway's poem, Christ's early rising, his prevenience, as it were, becomes the basis for a vision in which the natural world is contained and redeemed through God's transcendence. So we can see Hathaway developing Outram's tendency to place the particular within the eternal here. So the next quote begins, "But thou wast up by break of day." Might be the next. "But thou wast up by break of day, illuminating all this speech, the sun arising in the east, and fire flowers opened there and bloomed and died, and the glass was clear." So like Outram, Hathaway seeks after a vision of immanence that celebrates material particularities by seeing them in the context of the transcendence that will redeem the mortality of poetic and biological spheres, placing them within the context of eternity. In this respect, the vision of seeing face to face in Frost answers the desire expressed in an earlier poem called "A Sugar Bush" in Holy Week. Now, a sugar bush, of course, is a strand of maple trees used to tap syrup, so you're going to have to forgive me for ending on a note of national stereotype here. But in this evocative lyric, Hathaway further seeks the deepest possible intimacy with both Christ and the natural world simultaneously, all through an artistic medium consciously aware of the graceful errors that must redeem its limitations. In this case, though, it's the elongated wooden statues of the apostles in St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal that provide the impetus for this reflection on the redress that sacred poetry makes. It begins, "That if our shadows rise up like Charlier's apostles, they might at least cast on the ground where they have so long lain the forest floor regreening, as if it were at last spring. The guiding thought behind a sugar bush in Holy Week is the idea that a man will be happy if he's been able to meet even the shadow of a friend. Hence the play of light and shadow in the final two stanzas, where Herbert's Prayer 1, again, is a crucial intertext. And it reads, light, that there proves sufficient summer's growth in these regreening trees, to brook the Christ-side piercing spear of prayer for honey in the mouth of death. Or was it life? Or was it spring? That walking amid the risen light, I might confound my shadow in these tree shadows so utterly that I wear out, can no more find that seam that hath conjoined us together. Echoing the psalmist's description of the righteous man as a fruitful tree, Hathaway desires a relation with the natural world that finds its mediating principle in the divine, a principle that elevates rather than denigrates the created world. In this respect, he stands in a broader Canadian tradition that turns to Herbert in order to rethink a mode of sacred poesis that is responsive to the particularities of created nature while not being reducible to them. Essential to this apophatically sensitive tradition, I've argued, is Northrop Frye's post-romantic sense that the imagination partly discovers and partly generates a reality in which all things are interconnected with one another. No less significantly, this Canadian tradition suggests that absent of this kind of holistic vision, we will remain obtuse to the pressures and forces that Avison warned will out by means of one or another kind of explosion. Thank you.
All right, so now we'll just have a quick break for some coffee and snacks. If you could, we'll maybe take 10 minutes for that, and then we'll come back so you have a bit of time to prepare some questions.
Hello. So I really enjoyed that. I thought that was fantastic and like mind-blowing. I think Paul was totally right. I'll never see Herbert quite the same way again. So the last poet you were talking about, that image from Frost of the two-way mirror called to mind an image from Fry that I was thinking about throughout your entire talk, actually. It was weird because it kept coming to mind over and over again. And there's a quote from, I think it's Creation and Recreation, which is all about kind of the stuff you're talking about in some ways, where Fry talks about the way poetry deals with the life of humans, right? It's like, science is concerned with what's there, right? What's really there, whereas poetry and art are sort of concerned with the human world, right? And he uses this image of being on a train, where he's like, most of the time in the world of poetry, we're like we're in a train that's lit up, and we're in a tunnel, and we can't see out of the window because the window acts as a kind of mirror for our concerns, right? It just reflects back to us what we're concerned about. And it sort of reminded me of the economic thing that you were talking about with Avison, right? That sort of this worldly concern and all of that. But then he says, like, in rare moments, poetry kind of becomes like, suddenly it darkens inside the train car, and you get a glimpse outside of the train car, and you see this like vast, potentially indifferent universe that, even if it did make you, maybe it regrets having, it's like a very negative picture that Fry paints there. And so I kept hearing this in the background of what you were saying, the way the poet is kind of using, and I thought this was a really interesting way of talking about Herbert as like someone who is using the very familiar and like banal kind of stuff of ordinary life in order to sometimes like open a window onto something vaster and mysterious. And I guess what I'm wondering, and this is a question I don't know, I'm not sure I can get at it, but So one thing I'm wondering is, so you were sort of imagining this all as being sort of part of a Canadian tradition, right? And its indebtedness to Herbert. And I guess partially what I'm wondering is like, so what is it about Canada? Now, I'm just going to throw something out there, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this a little bit. To me, it seems like, and I'm going to, this is wild speculations. To me, it seems like there's a sense in which, Canada's not like a revolutionary country, right? Canada is not like a country that has like a kind of constitutional beginning or something like that. It's like a different, it kind of traces its roots back to this British tradition. And there's always been something about Canada that's like Hegel or something, like a kind of picture of the way institutions and things kind of unfold in an evolutionary way throughout history, and they kind of bring you to this point. And I feel like there's something in that that's akin to this like valuing of the particular and like the material, like all of that as a way that opens onto something vaster that's like not articulable in any other way. But I don't know, that's not exactly a question, but I'm sort of wondering what your thoughts are. But what is it about Canada that like makes us open to this?
Well, let me approach the Canadian side of this, but going back to Fry for 1 second. Because where I was coming at with Fry's business about the partial creation, the partial discovery of something through the cultural particular, comes in really from his book on the secular scripture, right? Where he has this one extraordinary paragraph, which is very easy to walk over, but he says, look, at some level, poets and other forms of culture have to be discovering something outside of themselves in order for any kind of maturation to happen. If it's just narcissistic reflection and a Rorschach process, then no maturation and transcendence of any sort could happen conceptually. But if it's all just it's all just coming from the outside in, and there's nothing being generated from the inside, then it would be very hard to come up with any sense of what the process is. Like it'd be so shocking and so surprising that you'd never be able to get a handle on it in terms of form and order. And so he's trying to say like there's some way in which both of these things are happening simultaneously. And in the critical field, there'd been a tendency to err too far on the sense of it's all coming from within us. It's all socially constituted at some level. It's ideology all the way down. And so he's saying that there has to be something underneath or above or outside the ideological in order for us to even be capable of the things we're clearly capable of. Otherwise, it's like, we're pulling ourselves up out of quicksand by our own hair somehow. How is this process happening? And I think that awareness prevented Fry from falling victim of the hyper-politicization of literary study and cultural studies. And that was partly, I think, his Canadian status that allowed him to do that, for the reasons you just articulated, that because we're not a revolutionary country, maybe we always have a healthy jaundiced eye towards the revolutionary. And that idea that it's politics all the way down, that it's ideology all the way down, often would be held by people who claim some kind of positive revolutionary disposition. And yet, in practice, we're often rarely truly revolutionary. So I think there's a connection here between this insight about a country that allows you to not maybe get caught up in every radically political movement and to see that as the ultimate horizon. So there's that. And then obviously there's just also the obvious, which is just the natural world in this country. The country's so vast that it's even when you look at a map, it's humbling, right? And so you have this sense of the world is, the natural world is much, much larger than us. And it's Fry who theorized the whole garrison thesis, right? That there's this kind of garrison mentality in Canada because we're afraid of the natural world. I think what we're seeing in the poets that I'm looking at is this much more positive environmental disposition that maybe Fry was only moving towards at the end of his career when he was sort of starting to answer some of his critics on that particular point. Because the same problem that you find in Blake, you find in Fry, which is are they rejecting nature? Are they rejecting the created world in favor of the imaginative world? And I think that's a misreading of Fry and Blake. I think they're actually both very positively disposed to the natural world, but with the awareness that there has to be this partial creation, partial discovery happening for any process of maturation to be even possible in the first place, right? So I think that's sort of what I would answer that, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. This is a kind of maybe a footnote to your question and maybe to your answer, I'm not sure. But I think, I'm trying to remember the name of the essay. It's about Canadian identity, and Fry tells the story of a guy who has an Inuit guide, and there's a snowstorm, and the guy says, we're lost. How are we going to get out of this? And the Inuit guide replies and said, where is here? And that sense of a kind of mundane givenness that Canadians may be less restive about than Americans. Violence and the fear of conspiracy. You bumped a lot of people off to get your country. And that's a cycle that repeats, I think, in the States. So I liked it, and I think this is also an essay about Canadian literature. What makes literature Canadian? And his answer was, where is here? And I don't think that conflicts with this sense of an immanence emerging from this kind of given mundane, or even a kind of inscrutable nature.
I think one of the essays here by Fry that really links with what Herbert's doing and what these poets are doing is Culture's Interpenetration, which is an underappreciated, kind of brilliant synopsis of settler Canadian art up until the 1970s when he's writing it. And what he's trying to do in that essay is respond to his critics who've been saying, you're stressing these abstract archetypes and you're losing the local. And his whole point is, no, you've missed the point. The archetypal only emerges at the moment you root deeply into the local. When you go deeply into the particular, that's when you suddenly start to communicate beyond your little local community. So his formulation for this is something like the more Faulkner talks about his unpronounceable Mississippi County, the more people in Belgium start to listen in, right? And I think Herbert's genius was exactly that the dramas he's just articulating are so particular. It's a very specific kind of crisis that emerges in many of his poems, right? He's like, oh, I was joyful for a moment. Where did that joy go? And he recovers it. And there's that uncanny quality of Herbert's verse where you read it and you think, this could have been written yesterday. Like there's a strange untimeliness about Herbert, and yet they're deeply rooted in the 17th century. Both of those things are true simultaneously, right? I mean, Rumi's like this, and I remember reading Rumi for the first time, and like, you're telling me this guy's like medieval? He sounds like a New Age poet from yesterday, right? And so it's that, but the point is this local, the more you fuse into the local, the more careful with it, the more true you are to it, the more that it's going to communicate beyond the local to other cultures and other times and places. And I think this is a principle that creative writing programs understand, but it's a principle that literary scholars have lost sight of, right? There's almost this embarrassment to speak this way. And I think Fry was ahead of the curve in that 1978 essay saying, like, no, the archetype and the local can necessarily must fuse, because if it's just an abstract symbol, then it's not going to resonate for anyone. So I think that's what the four poets that I'm analyzing are trying to get at in some of their own ways, without always being true to their own specific moments and places, whether it's Toronto or Cape Breton or elsewhere. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. That was a lovely, lovely talk. Very, very detailed and energizing. At the beginning, you suggested that one of the reasons that Canadian poets influenced by Herbert might be resonating in particularly vibrant ways now is because we're entering into a post-secular age. Could you just elaborate on that? I mean, I have an intuition that I agree, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about our moving into post-secularism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult thing to articulate, this kind of general zeitgeist shift that's happening, but it does seem like, I mean, just statistically, more younger people are converting, right, recently, particularly to the Catholic Church, than has been the case before. And there seems to be certainly a renewed interest in mindfulness and spirituality, and a less kind of dogmatic, militant atheism than used to be the case. I think somebody at lunch today mentioned that they think the new atheist turn has kind of exhausted itself, and there's more open-mindedness to it. But even in the realm of the academy, I mean, religion is really an important topic. People recognize, certainly after 9/11, that it's geopolitically a significant phenomena. And there's a certain exhaustion with the secular story, right? That it hasn't played out in the way that it was supposed to according to the liberal theory, right? It should have disappeared by now, right? I mean, the liberal secular theories, or it should have just remained in the private sphere. But there's all kinds of problems with that. You know, I mean, I don't know if you've read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, right? But one of the points he makes is the very concept of the secular is a Christian concept that emerges at a specific moment in the Middle Ages when the church was trying to distinguish its authority from some of the kingdoms and the secular forms. And it doesn't have the same history in Islam. So to expect Muslims in France and those places to be secular is already to ask them to be Christian in a particular kind of way. And so the very concept of secular is not a neutral concept that has completely divorced from Christianity. It comes out of Christianity. And so there's a growing recognition of the limits of our theories of the secular, certainly, and at a practical level, the way it's playing out in all kinds of ways. So, for example, on the plane ride to Winnipeg, I sat beside a woman who was working in epidemiology, who's working on how patients respond to spiritually attentive care, palliative care, right? So if they have a religious tradition, what difference does it make if they have spiritual care? Like, this is happening within epidemiology, within the medical sciences. I think is just part of a broader post-secular sense that we can't expect people to just keep religion in the closet all the time. So that's what I mean when I say I think we're now a little bit more ready to read these poets and to take them a little bit more seriously on their own terms, right?
We have time for one more question if anybody has one.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the relationship between, poesis and the apophatic tradition. I mean, it's there in all the poets you spoke about, and I'm very excited to look at their work. And I also liked seeing some, mention of illustration and book production and all of this, but I wondered if you could comment on that more broadly.
Sure. Well, for Herbert, an important thing to bear in mind is that the experience of knowledge in the realm of faith is not about gathering more information and being in possession of information. That way of thinking about what we're dealing with is just a category error. It's really about entering more deeply into a mystery and entering into a transcendent relationship that cannot be entombed through form. And yet, at the same time, we must use form in order to get at the very process of entering more deeply into that mystery. And so for Herbert, apophasis is partly a way of tricking the mind out of the tendency to reduce all forms of knowledge to information, right? So I find that Marcel's distinction between a mystery and a problem here really helpful, right? Marcel said, okay, a problem is something that you can stand over against. You can manipulate it and instrumentalize it and solve it. A mystery is something that involves you in your very being. Now, I think there's something perennial in the tendency to forget that distinction and to want to turn things into instrumental forms of knowing. If it's a perennial problem, it becomes a major crisis in the 17th century and has been so since. I've been in academic settings where people don't understand the distinction in the first place. And so apophasis is just one strategy for maintaining that distinction, that you're entering into a relationship that involves love, that involves your very being. And it involves the motion of grace where you have to be passive, right? And what I often like to tell my students is there are very simple daily activities that involve just letting go into something deeper, like falling asleep. Ever tried to fall asleep really actively? I'm really gonna try hard to fall asleep. It doesn't work that way. You have to let go, right? And so apophasis is a way of letting go into the dark, right? Into the dark of the divine. And so that's really how it works for Herbert. And I think that gets picked up in all the poets I'm talking about. Though for me, Domansky is the really interesting cat here. I think he's a really underappreciated poet who just is able to face places and go places that are shamanic in their intensity. And he comes out of those shamanic experiences and relates back what he's discovered. And so he's really steeped in Eckhart and that. So yeah, but I could go on, but it's that mystery problem distinction that's key for me in how I think about the role of apophasis in praising the divine through what it's not. All right,
Well, thank you so much. This has been very rich, and I think we can continue hanging out here for a bit if people have more conversation that they want to have. But I think we'll draw the formal time to a close now. So let's give another round of applause to Dr. Kuchar.